Hello, everybody. Welcome to Using AI to Assist in Mainframe Application Modernization. I'm Scott Fagen. I'm the mainframe evangelist at CDW, and I'm here today with Jennifer Velasquez from IBM. She's IBM America's DevOps leader, and let's just get right into it. How's it going, Jen?
It's going good. Ready to have the topic, and let's get going.
All right. So before we get started, right, there's lots of AI going on in the world. There's lots of AI going on at IBM and at CDW. We're going to want to scope this discussion just a little bit. This is really a conversation about using AI to accelerate mainframe application modernization. It's not a conversation about using AI to bolster your knowledge about mainframe operations or getting chatbots to fix your problems. And it's not a conversation about enhancing current applications on the mainframe or anywhere else for that matter by adding AI capabilities. It's really about taking a look at your application and using AI to help you and your developers and your testers out to modernize that application, to bring new capabilities to it, or just to get a better understanding of it, because some of these applications are older than me, and I'm old.
Definitely good to level set. I mean, you can't even open a newspaper right now that you don't see AI or Gen AI somewhere being applied to something. So glad to have that level set.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's always better to let people know what you're not going to talk about so they can leave early, right?
Exactly.
So one of the biggest challenges today in IT, and this is not just on the mainframe, because maybe your application on the mainframe is 50 or 60 years old, but certainly applications running on Unix, Linux, Windows can be 30 to 40 years old at this point. And I mean, I don't know if you really have to make a difference, but on the mainframe though, there's a good 230 billion lines of COBOL running out there, and there's a great deal of scrutiny, not on any individual one of them, but a great deal of scrutiny on people who are running COBOL and, why are you doing things this way? And, what are you going to do about it? And this all comes under this giant rubric of application modernization. And so, Jen, what's IBM's perspective about all this? I mean, it's mostly running on mainframes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I was sitting here thinking about, just that opening statement about accelerating application modernization. In some cases, it's even making it feasible to approach application modernization. Organizations have needed to do application modernization for as long as I've been in the industry, which my gray hair tells you just that's a long time. We've had the need to make those modifications. But the thing that we hear constantly is we're afraid to touch it. It works, we're not going to touch it. So they're trying to do things that are not natural because they are afraid to touch the assets that they have and that drive their business today. So I think it's interesting. We think about accelerating, but it's also just making it a viable option to do it. Right. And I'm excited where IBM has taken this and focusing in on the fact that we have the footprints. And the question becomes, what do I do with my current footprint? How do I use this asset and make it better? And if you think about what's happened over time and you look at the architectures and technologies that come about, if you didn't modernize your application, then the architecture that you have today is what was available 20, 30, 40 years ago. And if we think of the new architectures that take advantage of REST APIs, that take advantage of microservices, that take advantage of, and the list goes on, you may have adapted, but the question is, did you really look at that architecture and exploit it or manage it in a way that makes sense so that it's maintainable and manageable going forward, addressing all cost elements and such?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's funny, right? The fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's placed on COBOL from the outside is very much realized on the inside with some of the things you just said, right? We're afraid to touch it because we don't know what we're going to break.
No, right.
And that's not necessarily a statement about COBOL, but because COBOL's in the room, it gets tagged with it, right?
Yeah, it's almost like that game, and I forget, Juno, where you're going and you're trying to pull a peg to make sure that the whole stack doesn't fall down. That's how people approach application modernization. Okay, I'm just going to change this little bit and let's see if everything still holds together, right? We need to be able to embrace that and take it forward with confidence that it is going to be good and better for maintainability, complexity analysis, you name it. And that's where IBM is focused, not necessarily on how to make a COBOL construct, but how do we help you with the architectures you have today and move them forward into today's architectures and allow you to take and componentize or service enable your base that you have today, your inventories.
Sure, absolutely. So moving forward, to accelerate, your application modernization, you guys have come out with Watson X Code Assistant for Z, and it really does help kind of across the life cycle. Here you have it as a circular cycle, but across the life cycle for all the things that you need to do. And I understand that you just came out with code explanation, which is, I think, probably one of the more key functionalities, right? So you don't have to have an expert getting started on this thing. You can bring in somebody who might be good with comp sci or good with an understanding of how the application works externally.
Well, think about it. What was our trend, should we say, 20 years ago as it related to documentation? What happened 15 years ago? What happened 10 years? What happened 5 years? And you're going to see that the emphasis on documentation sort of, did the peaks and valleys in terms of representing the code base. Also, as people went in and did maintenance on the application, some of the documentation there didn't get updated. So the question is, do I believe it or do I not? And so focusing in on both understand and code explanation allows organizations to have that confidence of, I know what it is, I know what it's doing, I can quickly get people up to speed on that code base or bring validity to what somebody understands about the code base. I know for myself, if I look back at some of the code that I wrote years ago, it's going to be familiar. I mean, I think any code that someone writes, it's kind of like a glove, right? You know the look, the feel, you can identify it. But remembering all the details and all of the requirements that went around that piece of code, I don't know about you, but my memory starts to lose details the longer time elapses. So that's another point where this understand and code explanation, bring it to light, right? Give people certainty for what they understand and what they see in front of them.
I also think too, right? You talk about looking back at the code that you wrote 20, 30, I won't say a higher number, okay? Years ago, right? It also helps to understand that your coding maturity changes over time. Absolutely. And your understanding of concepts and also the use of the language. I recall, somebody bringing to me an error that I had written 25 years previously, right? I'm looking at it, I'm going, okay, so my age minus 25, how long I've been doing it at that point. And that, that kind of stuff happens, right? That stuff happens.
Right, it's the trade-off, right? Your learning curve, right?
Right.
Being exploited there. But the other thing about this documentation and what they've done is it allow you to take that documentation and it now becomes that reference base for your application going forward. We didn't have that. It was my English interpretation of defining what you were going to read and understand about this particular application, the things that I thought were important. Sometimes that was probably good. Sometimes I may have rushed a few details. Who knows?
Well, but also too, the other thing that's also true, right, is that the COBOL that was available, say in 1985, was primitive compared to 95, compared to 2005. I mean, one of the myths that goes on in the industry is that COBOL, it's 1957 all over again, and it's just not, right? So yes, there might be some lines of code from then, but the language has moved on, and it has lots of new features that weren't available, even 10 or 15 years ago.
In fact, that's one of the things a customer commented to me on as they were thinking about a particular application. There are things now that the compiler takes care of for them. So do I want to continue to support this code that is now, just part of the system? Or do I take the risk of removing it and then I have to go through my testing and everything else that goes along with it, but I have uncertainty if anything else happened to be pulling that in elsewhere? Now we can do it with confidence.
Yeah, I kind of like letting the machine do what the machine does better, and
Oh yeah.
let me do what I do better, right? I mean, so that takes us kind of to this refactoring stage, right? I know that one of the key elements of a application modernization exercise is to come out the other side with something that works mostly the same, right, from an external perspective as what you started with, right?
Functionally,
And
yeah.
right, and in some places we'll tell you, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take your application and we're going to put it into the giant Java munching machine, and we're going to kick out Java code, right? And in some cases you get something that's reasonable. In other cases you get something that looks like, I don't know, they call it Jobal, right?
Yeah.
Java code, but COBOL syntax and sensibilities.
Yeah.
So, tell me, a little bit more about why I'd want to, use this refactoring capability.
Well, if you remember back, and I'm dating myself, but remember when we used to code and design for reuse, right? The
Hmm.
idea that we had a segment of code, we knew it was going to be touched multiple times, we could apply it to multiple things, and well, but if I went and I made that something that was callable, well, then I had to test this one, I had to test that one, whatever. So we started copy and pasting and moving things everywhere, right?
Right.
It was a way for us to get through our processes fast and quick, but it wasn't necessarily what was best for the architecture and the complexity analysis of the code that we're trying to maintain, or should I say, those of us years later are trying to maintain. So refactoring
Right.
does a really good job of saying and identifying areas that you may want to have as a service. You still have to make the cognitive decision of, is this the right thing or the wrong thing to do? Based off of your application and the requirements that you have, you may need to have it more as a monolith so that I am really just cutting it to the bone from a performance standpoint and getting that
Hmm.
best performance. In other cases, it's not imperative to have that, and it would make sense for it to be a service because of the complexity associated with the way that the program is written today. I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes if I took a book and I had it and I was reading it through and it didn't have any chapters and I'm now into the 1,000 page, I lose context of what it is. They break it up into chapters so that you can follow it. I
Hmm.
think of code that way as well. If the program is 1,000 lines long, one comprehension, 10,000 lines, another comprehension, 100,000 lines, okay, I'm starting to lose context really bad. And not only that, but what kind of constructs are in there? What complexity is it? All of
Yep.
those things come into play here. But the way that IBM has approached it, it's put it into the hands of the organization or the developer to say, I want to take action on what you've identified for refactoring. What it's doing for you is ensuring that as you refactor it, you don't introduce error in making or taking that piece of code and saying it's separately callable. It takes care of all the glue and those things
Hmm.
that we happen to human error drop sometimes. Now, if in refactoring you decide that particular application, I mean, again, 30, 40 years ago, we wrote everything in COBOL. Why did we come out with other languages in life? Could it be because we optimized them to do certain things? Maybe. If you go along with that thread, then there's going to be code that exists today in that 230 billion lines of code that may not make sense to be in COBOL. And if it doesn't make sense, we wanted to give organizations a way to quickly go from that refactor into transforming it to Java. Now, we hope to do other languages as well, but right now we hit the big one, which is Java. And so it takes it and makes sure that semantic correctness is there for this new Java program. And in addition to that, as you were talking about, we did not do the line by line. Our goal was to stay true to the Java languages so that you got the benefit of the Java language, not something that was, what's a nice word for that?
It's like when you hand Google Translate a sentence at a time, right? Each sentence might be correct, but when you put them together in a paragraph where you say them to somebody who's a native speaker, they look at you like,
what were you really trying to do?
What are you trying to communicate to me? Yeah,
Mhm.
and I think also, when you come down to it, a lot of these COBOL programs have gotten large, inordinately large over the years because people keep adding functionality to them. And
Yeah.
just logistically refactoring them down into smaller services, which means they're going to be in smaller compartmentalized pieces, means that you don't have the same kind of pressure and serialization at the programmer level to make changes.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, in addition to that, think about your testing effort, right? So now let's say that we've got to go back and we are now making a modification into something that we refactored and we need to go test. Well, now how many lines of code am I looking at in order to test versus when it was in the larger form? I'm not saying that I'm not going to test it in context, but that first level of testing now all of a sudden is something that I can relate to, right? It's easily seen, it's easily confined. The complexity is not out the roof.
Right, and certainly depending on how that code is accessed, you may or may not have to test it with other pieces, right? You can unit test it as a solo unit in many cases, as opposed to saying, okay, here's my 1,000-line COBOL program. How do I wind my way to the piece that changed? Right. And building test cases that are going to wind your way through the code. So I think that there's a lot of value here because I think the biggest headline here is that you're allowing a customer to, after the fact, apply modern programming techniques to a potentially 50-year-old program. Yeah. And do it safely.
Yeah. But we realize when you look at a application, right, and I'm doing everything from the code base, I cannot speak to non-functional requirements. I cannot speak to other requirements that may be influencing the way it's architected. That's the reason why it's important for that decision to sit with the developer, the one that understands it in context of the overall business requirement.
That's good because we kind of took care of number 3 and number 4 on this slide in that last conversation, because what we talked about was taking pieces out to make sure that they run the best they can, or taking pieces out to put them in a language that's more amenable to the functionality, right? Some things are clearly easier or better done in Java than they are in COBOL, and I would assert that there's stuff that's better done in COBOL or better left alone in COBOL than it is in Java. So,
absolutely. That was one of the conversations I had with the clients. They were, well, why wouldn't I take all of it to Java? And I'm like, Java has overhead compared to what COBOL does. I mean, let's look at those other requirements that you have to decide what makes most sense. Is it transactional based or is it something that is represented from an object model standpoint? There are decisions that need to be made there, but that's the reason why when we go to any, let's say, greenfield development, here's what I need done. What makes most sense? What language makes most sense as a result of what it needs to do? And we're seeing a lot of change there compared to what I saw, let's say 30 years ago, where it's not always a de facto answer. It needs to go here. We're getting to take advantage of platforms, architectures, on-prem, off-prem, whatever, in order to optimize our experience in the delivery. It's all part of one equation, right? What's our what's our operating cost? What's our best language to get the best performance, the reliability? Which platform do we need it on? You are in control of those major decisions.
Right. Yeah, and I mean it's kind of interesting too, right? Because the choice or the decision to move something into Java may be completely predicated on, well, we have a package of open source code that interacts with Java and not with COBOL, right? So you may want to just figure out and slice out those pieces that interact there and move them out because now you can take advantage of somebody else's development, right? That we talked about the reuse before, right? Reusing somebody else's stuff is just as important as reusing your own.
Yep.
And
totally agree.
And tell us a little bit more about auto-generated testing and validation at the end of this.
Okay, so when we transform, you have identified what the service is, and we're transforming it to Java. Well, given that we know what you had from a COBOL standpoint, you define what that service is. Our goal behind Validate is to ensure that we have semantic correctness between the way that we transformed it into Java and that of what the COBOL created, right? It's not to say that it is your unit testing a functional flow for in context of the overall program. Application development, your CI/CD, all of those things still apply. This is new code. And as new code, you want to put it in context of your business processes or your delivery practices. That's not what Validate's about. Validate is to help give certainty and confidence in that what we transformed it to has validity going back to what the service that you identified was.
Right. So that when I started point A, and X equals 5. And when I go through point B, X will still be equal to 5, right? Not 4.9, not 5.2, right? I mean, that's critical, right? And that's what most people are afraid of, right? Is that they'll without knowing it or without doing it purposefully, make a mistake or introduce an error.
Absolutely. And I mean, when you look at it from a service standpoint, input, output, this is what it does. If we were to try to put it in context of the full functional flow, well, we don't have that. The other thing that this does when we do the transform is any interoperability that needs to be addressed. And a lot of this came through from the compiler that we were talking about earlier. We want to have that taken care of too. Once again, reducing the risk for the organization that's making the decision as to where does this service need to run. Right.
Ultimately, the being able to solve the little picture issues in the big picture. Right. And talking a little bit about that, right? We've got the code explanation that's coming out or has come out, I guess, at this point, as we've talked, as we go. I think the last time we tried to do this, it wasn't out yet, but that's okay. But the code explanation is kind of the micro view of the world, right? You give it a bunch of lines of code and it's going to, tell you what those bunch of lines of code are. So that's kind of being able to look at the tree. And at the same time, the same set of tools are also going to allow you to look at the forest to understand what's in between the trees and the moss and the streams that are flowing and the small bunny, the bunny rabbits that are hopping around the forest, right? Yeah. So I think what it means, so now what you've done is you've giving the developer and the architect also the ability to go tops down or bottoms up.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to playing that game, right? I'm going to remove that peg. What does it mean? What does it mean to my overall structure? And so both for the developer and the architect, understanding the application or jobs in question, you want to be able to relate to it within your ecosystem that you have defined, your architecture, real estate. And so that's the beginning point of understanding and having the confidence that when you decide that you want to move something to a service, that it makes sense. If I have something that shows visually that it is highly coupled to everything else in the world, well, I may think differently about if it makes a service. If it's an island off here, does it make sense to make it a service because nobody's calling it? Do I have a vision of where we're going to go in the future that's going to be using this? Or am I just doing it for the sake of doing it, right? You have to have context. And that's what application understanding really does for us is give you that in quick form. Instead of reading 230 billion lines of code, let's look at it visually and start being able to dive into the various pieces and parts that are related or relative to my exercise at hand.
Right. So you would use the application understanding level of work of this display or this visualization to then go and choose the pieces and be able to do the understanding and the code explanation of the individual pieces to make sure that when you do the refactoring that you've covered everything and that you've covered everything correctly.
I think of it as my insurance guide. When I'm driving my car down the road, I have all of the manuals tucked into the glove box. And when there is a problem or when I want to go do something that maybe I haven't ever done before, I check the manual to see whether or not that's a viable thing to do. I.e., we needed to change the tires. Where do I put the jack? Well, let's take a look at where it says to put the jack versus what I just thought, just from looking at things. This is that insurance that gives me confidence that my understanding of the application and the dependencies associated with it are true. And it also gives it to me in an up-to-date manner. Whereas maybe the last time that I touched this program was 10 years ago. Is my memory still good? Did somebody else come in and do anything or not?
Yep.
This gives me that certainty that it's true. This is where it's at. And so the decisions I'm making are in present day and in context of our real estate.
Well, and I think it's also a terrific accelerator for somebody who might be on the job 5 years and is working on code that's older than they are, right? I mean, to me, right? I mean, when I was coming up as a programmer, I didn't write a whole bunch of COBOL, but I certainly wrote a bunch of PL1. My usual go-to was a guy in the department. Like, so what does this do? Can you explain it to me? What is, I mean, never seen this statement before or this form of writing code before. And it sounds like the AI can kind of fit in there and help with those sort of things.
You think of all of those where we're onboarding people. How do I accelerate? I think every organization I work with asks me, how can I accelerate getting somebody up to speed and to take responsibility within my development teams? And giving them tools like this from a productivity standpoint that allow them to take general conversations from our team meetings and go back and have the documentation to validate their understanding of something, or to give them the ability to explore, right? Now, we were talking about that particular program, or let me see exactly where that sits within everything else. What all is referencing? What data is it going to? What data tables is it, manipulating? These are all questions that you may have, but it before has been, okay, let me find what the program name was. Then once I have the program name, then I'm going to go and pull it up, and now I'm going to start reading. And every time I read and find something that's being referenced, I'm having to follow that link and continue to reading. I don't have a way to look at an index for the overall architecture that allows me to process it the way that my brain is aligned. So for new people coming in, this is just icing to help me accelerate, because nobody wants to feel less than smart. I'm trying to think of positive words. When you're always knocking on the SME's door saying, hey, do you mind, can you explain this to me? I'm sorry, I read this, and I still have some memories of that one. I came across this, and I don't see how this is being applied. It constant interrupts to your SME, which is, what the cost of a context switch is. And then for the person that's asking all the questions, it starts to hit on my confidence on what I can do. This takes and closes the gap between those two, making one sufficient and opening up time for the other.
So it's kind of a COBOL / application SME on demand.
It is. It is. And it lets you navigate sort of like your, what's the Waze app, right? Doesn't matter which turn I go, it's going to represent whatever I see. So if I happen to go down a particular path because I have an interest in how those calls are being made or what it's referencing, I can go down that path. I can still get back to my original location.
Right. It'll always route you home.
Yes, it will.
So let's talk a little bit more about, kind of the different approaches that people take to application modernization. One is the big bang, right? You call up a third party, some consultancy, and they take all your COBOL code and they disappear with it. And, best I can figure is it goes into a giant meat grinder and little streams of Java come out of the meat grinder.
It really depends, but yes.
But on the other hand, right, and I've written articles about this as well. That just doesn't seem to be the most expeditious or risk-free way to do things, right? Because then you have you're going with something that claims to have represented your entire 40 years of application development or 50 years of application development, and lots of accommodations for potentially things that were technologically not possible or technologically inconvenient, or application patches that were just sort of, well, we had to do this because this business rule changed on us, right? And so to be confident in something like that is, I would say, hard. But if I take this other approach, this incremental approach, that should allow me to be able to, do it piecemeal, right? But doing a piecemeal has some issues as well, especially if I'm still doing COBOL development like I did COBOL development in 1985.
Well, and there's a couple of things there. I mean, everyone's done the searches and seen the headlines on how many millions and billions have been lost in app modernization efforts, where people have taken full context. I'm going to be migrating this to Y, whatever Y is. A couple of things there. One, is it even conducive in what the target was? We talked earlier about having it fit for purpose or taking advantage of the language and the constructs and the things that make those languages good for certain types of workload. Let's align that and recognize that there is value across all of them. It just depends on what we're trying to do. So when you think about what we've been doing with DevOps and CI/CD and everything that organizations are trying to do, it's about optimizing the efforts that they're doing and driving costs down. When I do big bang approach with modernization, I don't have checkpoints to say that I've met those non-functional requirements. I don't have a way of looking at anything and saying that it is or isn't capturing all of the business rules that we're going. There's just so many places in there. And I realize that there's all sorts of different contracts that people have done, and they may have taken big chunks and some little chunks. But when we're doing that without it being in a controlled fashion, we now own, how do I make this a consistent business delivery so that my organization continues to get value and can drive their business according to the rules and the systems that they've had for years. So how do you de-risk that? You de-risk it by breaking it down into smaller chunks. You de-risk it by leveraging automation in order to provide the interconnections and giving you control over if it does or doesn't make sense within the requirements. The other element there is when we think about trying to do that identification, and you talked about it earlier, if I take this item and I do line by line, moving over to a different language, and yet it's not true to the architecture of that language, how's it going to run there?
Unlikely as well as here, right?
Exactly. So all of a sudden that concept of optimizing, de-risk, total cost, we're saying those three don't matter. We're just going to lump chunk and go. And those things have been proven not to work. So Watson Code Assist, and you'll see that we have several assistants that are out there in the market now. But Watson Code Assistant for Z specifically is to give that control back to the organization to make right decisions that allow them to take advantage of the fit for purpose, that allows them to get the best fit language for what the code is doing.
Right. So I think we've talked about a lot of this stuff here already, but the point being that it's not just one shot, right? You go through this several times, right? You're going to go through, modernize a piece, be successful with it, or because you haven't done everything, if it's unsuccessful, you throw it away. Right? You know, if you wind up choosing the wrong thing, or the technology that you decide to centralize on for that piece doesn't work out, right? You can throw it away, and you haven't burned a whole lot of money. You might have burned some confidence and some competence, but you haven't burnt the whole application, and you haven't thrown the whole thing away. And at the same time, right, you guys have built in AI into almost all of the pieces, right? And that's not necessarily generative AI, but there's lots of kinds of AI that's in here. Even inside of the compilers, there are, certainly bits of AI that help choose the right way for a loop to be optimized, or particular kinds of storage activities to be optimized. So it really is permeating the stack.
Well, how do I say this? We've had lots of terms for a lot of times that have provided the illusion in the small on AI or machine learning or big data, in elements. This movement that you have seen recently with generative AI is how can we capitalize on those concepts, but think about them in this larger element of driving business change. And so you're right. We have taken AI and Gen AI and infused it in some of the steps where we could today. It doesn't stop there. Some of the areas that are coming are some of my favorites, so we'll have to do another session maybe in a year. But I love the fact that we're now able to do things that understand the code base by bringing that large language model and bringing in the intelligence of COBOL into our language model. We can support with that finer resolution on what we provide back these particular capabilities. The other element to think about is that as we think about application modernization, it may mean different things to different people. And how far or what you need to do is where IBM has said it's in your control, right?
Right.
So some organizations are just about how do I document and understand the application so I can have more confidence in making the changes I need to make. In others, it is about how do I reduce the complexity of this thing, because it's killing us every time that we make a change, the amount of testing and things that we need to do. You get to take the right approach to that. I'm excited about what we're trying to do from an optimization standpoint. I'm excited about what we're trying to do in R&D standpoint of taking generative AI and infusing it in every step of the software delivery lifecycle, taking those things that a developer can use assistance to enable them to focus on the finer things, the things that only they can make a decision on. What's the right fit?
Right.
What's the best fit architecture? What's the best fit language? What's the right platform for this to be running in? How am I reducing my cost? They're the only ones that can put all of those pieces of the picture together. So if I can take Gen AI into these steps that help them to accelerate that, then we can deliver on taking these assets into this century.
Absolutely. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, right? There are still some problems back at the ranch, right? There's still some things that have to be solved, right? All these development activities are wonderful to speed up the developer and potentially the architect into the next round of development. But if you haven't modernized your code delivery process, have a modern or even a semi-modern CI and CD process, all that's going to happen is you're going to frustrate the developers because all this is going to stack up.
Yeah, you're going to queue it up pretty bad, because the faster we make you in being able to create, if you don't have a way to deliver what you created, that's called creating inventory or backlog, right?
Yep.
We don't want to do that. So yes, having things like automated testing to support the changes being made and to be able to validate it in context of the flow, the transaction itself, right? Or the set of jobs. Those things are important because as I change, I want to be able to test it and move it on along. Likewise with the delivery. And I guess one of the things that I had a dialogue with a client on, they were like, oh, really excited about the Gen AI and how it's going to accelerate application modernization that they're doing. And I was like, that's great, but why are you excited about that acceleration if we're not doing anything about the way that we're delivering it or the way that we're going through the SDLC? And they never really had kind of connected those two pieces. This helps us accelerate taking that monolith and making it from a complexity standpoint or getting the documentation and the like. It accelerates the ability for the developer, the architect, and even leads to be able to process what they're looking at. Right. But the delivery is totally separate. We want to support that. They complement each other. One is what we're doing. The other one is how we're getting it out the door, how we're getting it into production.
Right. Yeah. The obviously, right. If you're able to refactor into many smaller pieces, you're able to deliver those smaller pieces sequentially. But if they all plow into each other, you've just rebuilt the monolith on the test side.
Exactly. And you're going to drown people. It
Yep.
all works hand in hand. But it's exciting to see that we are taking a lot of the manual steps that we had in the past. We're de-risking them through automation, such as a
Mhm.
CI/CD pipeline, such as automated testing to ensure that we have more coverage in our tests than what we could do manually because of
Mhm.
time that would permit within a cycle. And now we're helping to accelerate and bring confidence and de-risk what we're doing from an app mod standpoint. So
Right.
they all worked hand in hand in order to help organizations accelerate getting their
Yep.
deliveries to production.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. So, we've talked about this a little bit, right? There's some fundamental distinctions between what Watson X Code Assistant for Z does versus some of the other Gen AI tools. Is there anything we haven't talked about that's on this page?
No,
Or is
I
this
think
just a good
we
slide
hit
for
those.
an app dev guy to carry around with them?
It is, but to just summarize it, a lot of your Gen AI tools, they're about creating code snippets, not necessarily understanding the code that you have.
Mhm.
Ours is about understanding the code we have. We understand that in the COBOL world and the like, that we're not going into Greenfield.
Right.
We have the code base. It's what to do with it, right? We're
Mhm.
not trying to accelerate people to pile on top of it and just create more that we increase the complexity and such. So we're trying to
Right.
hit the heart of the matter to help organizations in the brownfield be able to push that code forward. So that's one of the major differences. It's not to say that there aren't code snippets. I mean, we've had code snippets for years in
Yep.
our IDE, for instance. That's been
Sure.
there. It's just how it's
Well, I
applied.
mean, that kind of stuff is AI writ small, but it's valuable, right? To ensure that somebody doesn't miscode a select or a case, right?
Well,
Missing missing the closing brace is valuable, right? If you
I
could cut
count on
out
my
one compile,
IDE for
yeah,
all
yep,
of my code development. I mean,
yep,
I used to be very much green screen all the way,
hmm
but let's just say that IDE helps me with those particular things. Anything that
sure.
has braces, brackets, or the like, I wanted to tell
Period.
me what the heck I'm supposed to be doing here instead of me
Yeah,
having to remember. Because I float through so many languages. That's the other thing.
yep,
The more languages I support, the more I need the IDE to keep me grounded on the
yep,
constructs within that language.
yep.
Yeah.
Syntax matters. Syntax
It's
matters.
syntax does matter, and I don't want that slowing me down. And that's where the IDE really kind of pulls a rabbit out of the hat, if you will, and helps me out. The other element, and we covered this earlier, is that big bang, huge investment hasn't paid off, huge risk because of that. Those that
hmm
have done the, I'll call it turn the crank, take a line, spit it out as Java. The problem that you have there, depending on what the business that was needed, what those requirements were, maybe it works,
Yep.
but it may miss all of the non-functional and other kinds of things, such as what size batch window do you have? Is what I'm doing taking me outside, or am I just still, did I have that room or cushion to work with now that I'm doing something in Java?
hmm
The other element that we have when we do the line by line is it's not natural to read it that way. It's not
Right.
natural to read COBOL in Java structures. It
hmm
just it doesn't compute. When you're
Well,
reading
you're just
Java, you're expecting something.
yeah, the Java developer is going to look at it and go, "What the heck is that?" Right? They're going to look at it and go, "Yeah, it's Java syntax, but it doesn't look like any Java program I ever worked on." Or
It,
and so to get the
it reminds me of when I first started writing Python. So I was doing some constructs and I didn't take advantage of some of the accelerators it had. And my daughter was reading my Python and she's like, "What is this? I mean, I get what you're doing, but why?" And I'm like, "Well, because that's how I would have done it if it was in C++."
Mhm.
And she's like, "Yeah, but you don't need to do it that way. Here, all you need to do and put three pluses. Now you've got this done." And I'm like, well, okay. So
Yeah, that's what,
that maturity that you were talking about from
right.
earlier, in when the code is written, you can kind of read the maturity of the person. Well, that's another place. If I take
Right.
line by line across what's written, because it's not true to the Java constructs, from a maturity standpoint, as you think another 10 years ahead, and somebody looks back on this code, is going to look at it and go, this not good written. No, not hitting another
Right.
complexity kind of issue because it doesn't hold true to that language.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's syntax and there's like semantics or sensibilities around the language, and if it
Yes,
doesn't look like what everybody else is expecting, you're in for a world of hurt. So
absolutely.
let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing with customers now. We have a couple of case studies here.
It's ranging all over the board because you have to first ask, what is the client trying to get out of using generative AI? In so many cases, I can't think of a client yet that hasn't told me that understanding the application hasn't already accelerated everything that they're doing. It's not that we haven't had understanding, but being able to apply it now is something that they're doing on a regular basis. The developer productivity gains in the sense that they no longer have to worry about some of those details, those things that can be construed, i.e. interoperability. How do I code and embed that in? What do the calls look like? Taking that off their plate and letting them focus on the intent of what they're doing from a business perspective definitely has accelerated productivity gains. So it's kind of astounding what it's been able to do. There's been some of these pieces and parts, I would say, in the past, but not where we've been applying them in context of application modernization. And that's where these numbers really push through the roof.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like, if you're just talking about productivity gains, right, 2 to 2.5, that's pretty impressive considering, how old and clunky some of these applications are, and just in the sense that it is unlikely that the people who are getting these productivity gains are the people who were around when they were being built or were actively being developed, right? So this 80% less time for application understanding is huge, right? It's a training opportunity. It frees up the people who are the experts to really work on the sticky problems, not on the how come this perform is coded this way.
One of the things that I have seen where it's really just kind of knocking the doors out is organizations that have gone through acquisitions or mergers, right? A lot of times as we go through acquisition and mergers, we may not have the people that took care of those particular applications. So they almost quarantine them and say, nobody can touch those because we don't know anything about them. So it's unlocking all of those doors. It's definitely helping when it comes to, I'll say, the next generation coming on board and understanding and maintaining these particular applications. The numbers are astounding.
They are, right. I just don't need to see another press conference from a governor of a state saying, "Well, can you bring? We need you to drag out a couple of COBOL programmers. Come and volunteer and help us fix our, our retirement system or our benefit system." I think this I think will definitely help. Good developers who may not be the most literate about COBOL or the most literate about these applications come on board much faster, which I think is critical today.
Well, and for me, I've got too many years under my belt, but the statement that, well, there's too much risk with us making that particular change. Mm-hmm. If I heard that, it's kind of like the annoying kid, right? That always comes back with one response. I hear it and I'm like, can you afford not to make that change? And if we don't make that change, what are we doing? And now I have to maintain this one-off. It doesn't make any sense. And I'm a common sense kind of approach person. So I'm really excited that this has paired that productivity in such with lowering the risk, right? It's not one or the other. It's bringing them together and complementing the experience so that you can drive the changes that you've needed to, and make good decisions instead of having the excuse to go a different direction.
Yeah, it's my wife says it to my kid all the time. Make good decisions. But it really does make sense, right? So, I think we can kind of just wind it down here. But we have lots of resources here in the slides. These are all clickable links and will be available on the site with the presentation, with this recording. And both IBM and CDW have approaches to this and work together, or will work apart to help you as a customer make your way through this application modernization journey, conundrum, slog up a hill. It all depends on how you want to look at it. But I personally think it's very important. There's lots of options here. I know that you and I would mostly say that modernization in place is the least risky and most likely to be successful and performant, right? I mean, we've talked about the Big Bang not working. We've also seen plenty of times where you try to rewrite something and replatform it and run it someplace else, and it just doesn't work because the mainframe does stuff well that other platforms don't. And there are plenty of things that I would say don't put that on a mainframe. So I'm not trying to be a bigot here.
Well, I totally agree.
So do you have any last words?
No, it's been fun. I hope to talk with everyone again, and have a great day.
Great. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us on this webinar. We hope that we've provided a little bit of entertainment and a lot of knowledge, or maybe a lot of entertainment and a little knowledge. And we hope you join us for the next one when we have that one. Thanks so much. Have a great day.